Welcome back to the Engage in Truth broadcast. This is Steve Ford, your co-host, along with Pastor John Bornschein, Senior Pastor at Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley, located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Thank you so much for joining us again today. Now, as you will recall, last episode we left off in Daniel chapter 7, where this time it was Daniel who had the dream that needed to be interpreted. So let's open our Bibles and see what God has to teach us today as we continue our journey through Daniel chapter 7. Remember that you can find prior episodes of this series, along with other episodes of this broadcast, archived on the church's website at calvaryfountain.com. That's calvaryfountain.com. And here's Pastor John to get us started.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ford. Yes, we've been talking about the vision of these beasts, these four beasts that Daniel was given a glimpse of. And last program, we talked a great deal of what scholars believe those beasts symbolize, which nations they might represent. And some of that was still a future tense for Daniel. And yet for us, we look back and go, well, that's actually a past tense. So is it possible then as we look now backwards, we can then have an understanding of how to look forward? And that's what prophecy tends to do, give us a foreshadow of events. So when Jesus Christ would speak of the abomination of desolation that was to come, well, that was a bit of an alarm because people thought it had already occurred, right? They looked at what Antiochus IV had done in desecrating the temple and causing incredible chaos and disarray within the kingdom and causing men to eat bacon and splattering pig's blood across the temple, desecrating it, slaughtering Jews, wanting to be worshiped, considering himself a god on earth, and doing this all from the Temple Mount. And so, of course, he was a foreshadowing, a type of an Antichrist figure that Jesus Christ says, as that was, it will happen again. There will be an abomination of desolation, to which would cause an alarm in the hearer to think, oh, wait, so there's another round of that forthcoming. So we have to be mindful as we read prophecy. We see that type and foreshadowing of a future event. And so Daniel's given this vision that was still probably greatly alarming, as we'll read about here, and how he responds to this. I don't want to give that away, but how he responds to this vision and these beasts that come up and how they devour and certain characteristics of them. And I dropped a little bit of maybe an alarm to some folks as they were listening last week to say, okay, while scholars are rightly interpreting that biblically, I believe, of what they represented, is it also possible that they represent future kingdoms that look very similar to the kingdoms of old? They act in a similar way. They behave in a certain way, have certain attributes and characteristics. Because when we talk about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, what we're talking about there are demonic forces that are manipulating men, steering kingdoms to battle. And what we then realize quite clearly of Ephesians chapter 6, that we are not battling against flesh and blood, though the battle takes place with flesh and blood attacking one another. There is a huge spiritual series of events that are happening in a heavenly places, in a spiritual plane that is taking place all around us. And so just because the Prince of Persia once existed in that way doesn't mean the Prince of Persia went away, right? They're armoring up again using other flags and other people groups to do the same thing. And so we find today that Persia is still in the headlines, right? We're still dealing with Iran. And right now we're right at the threshold here of potentially going to war with Iran. And there are riots ensuing and all these things happening globally. And we thought, well, wait a minute, I thought that was only a time of Daniel issue. No, there's still a demonic force at work here, manipulating the minds of men. And God, of course, is in control of all of these things. But just because the name changes of that country and the flags change doesn't mean that this battle has gone away. As it once was, will be again, and it still continues as it will until the very end when Jesus Christ comes and reigns. So what I proposed last week is it possible that what we're seeing there is image of other types of kingdoms with different names and different flags, and something that obviously affects Israel, because when we look at these prophetic visions, it's always impacting Israel. So what Daniel is giving us revelation of is not talking about every single country on the face of the earth, But as those nations impact Israel, it has a prophetic role. And so we at least need to address that there are other kingdoms that have impacted Israel, and yes, even the rebirth of a nation. So is it possible we're also seeing that revealed here? And so what I teased our listener with last week was the reality that the British Empire is not really one that scholars tend to lay claim to of what Daniel is seeing. But let's just look at it. Just entertain me for a moment in this. The British Empire would become the largest empire in history, and it began its expansions in 1497 AD at the very end of the Roman Empire. So if we agree that the image of the statue that was revealed to Nebuchadnezzar and then Daniel used to give it translation interpretation to that was the Roman Empire, and then suddenly we see these 10 toes that are iron mixed with clay, we're going to see something else that comes out of the sequence of events of the Roman Empire. And people believe, well, that must be a rebirthed Roman Empire. Well, let's look at these visions of these beasts that would also come on the world. Well, the British Empire would become this incredible, powerful force across the entirety of the earth right at the end of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was not necessarily the end of what would occur. It was something else would follow suit, right? So the colonies ultimately resisted British rule in these Americas. And under October 19th, 1781, the British surrendered to General George Washington. That's where we ended the broadcast last week. Now, the fact that its zenith, the empire covered 25% of the world, ruling over 458 million people. It was at this point that God would use them to defeat the Ottomans. And the Ottomans came to a collapse in 1918. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire had control of everything that was formerly the Roman Empire. Everything from Italy south all the way into North Africa was no longer the Roman Empire. It was the Ottoman Empire. So we're talking just over 100 years ago was the end of an empire that looked very much like the Roman Empire, even with its headquarters, its capital in what was formerly Constantinople, which was the capital of Rome, was Istanbul today. Okay, so we have to understand from Turkey's role all the way, everything that was formerly the Roman Empire was now under Muslim rule. Okay, so the key nations that would be involved in the Ottoman Empire's demise and battling with the British was the British Empire, the Russians, the Germans, and the Ottomans. Now, this led to the mandate for Palestine and ultimately the establishment once again of the nation of Israel on May 14th, 1948. So is it possible that these nations represent the other kingdoms that will ultimately have a role in the final kingdom of the beast? Now, each of these countries have impacted Jews around the world in significant ways. And according to Ezekiel chapter 38 to 39, Magog with Rosh and Meshech, it's most likely Russia, and they will lead a confederacy of mostly Islamic nations. We see Iran involved, Turkey involved, all the way down to Ethiopia, the Cushites. They're all involved in this, and they lead them against Israel in the last days. And I find it interesting that Daniel 7 was written in close proximity with Ezekiel 38 and 39. We forget that Ezekiel was given these prophecies down with the people at the same time Daniel is given revelation from God. So God's disseminating this, that Daniel, you're getting a piece of this. Ezekiel, you're getting a piece of this. But we're expected as the reader now to pull both parts together to understand the whole. So we remember Ezekiel's prophesying. So it's possible here that the same spirit of Babylon, represented by the lion with the eagle's wings that are plucked, also represents another future kingdom that's symbolized by the lion that lost its wings. What nation could that possibly be? Well, if we look to England and the United States, we certainly see the eagle and the lion represented there. Both nations have greatly impacted the nation of Israel in both positive and negative ways. And perhaps the heart given to it that was when the British returned the land to the people of Israel, and along with the United States that comes to its defense, maybe that's the heart that's represented in this vision of that particular beast. So it's also possible that the spirit of the Medes and Persians, represented by the bear, is also found in Russia. So it's possible that the spirit of the leopard that was found in Germany, the maker of the Leopard tanks, I mean, think about that. Perhaps there's a Fourth Reich that's on the horizon, which would make up its fourth head. So Persia, let me sidetrack here for a moment. Persia, Iran is still involved in the end times on the attack on Israel, according to Ezekiel 38, verse 5. So is it possible that the clay and the iron toes of the final kingdom involved is not specifically the Roman Empire, but that which came out of it, the Ottoman Empire, with 7 heads, possibly representing the 7 caliphates? And it will reemerge, as even the president of Turkey has declared. Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants a 7th or now an 8th caliphate. He wants a neo-Ottoman empire to emerge. And he, of course, is willing to lead all of this, right? But we have to remember that borders may change. The names of countries may change. But the spirit of our enemy who roams the earth, as we see in Job chapter 1, verse 7 and chapter 2, verse 2, is still the same beast as he's always been. And he's the one who was ultimately evicted out of heaven. And that's why he's called the dragon. He is going to lose. That's really how this story plays out. It's not an if he's going to lose. The Bible assures us that he's going to lose. And so whether the kingdoms come, they will rise, they fall. Flags change, leaders change. But ultimately, as we keep our eyes on Israel, all of this landscape and all of this hostility toward Israel, toward God ultimately, toward Yahweh, and all of his people, the Christian and Jew alike, all who call on the name of the Lord are going to be the enemy of the state, because Satan thinks that he rules over all the kingdoms of the men. And it tells us in Revelation that he will give permission that God will give permission to Satan to be able to attack his people, but he will be defeated. And so praise be to God that this whole story ends with Satan's demise. He's going to be lassoed, thrown into the abyss by one angel. Doesn't even take a whole bunch of angels, just one. And he's thrown into the abyss. He's defeated. The false prophet and the Antichrist will also be defeated, and Christ will reign victorious. So, Dr. Ford, let's just kind of recap for just a moment, because we're just scratching the surface in Daniel chapter 7. We only made our way through the first 7 verses, and we haven't even really gotten into some of the depth of this. But what we're talking about here today on Engage in Truth is eschatology. That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a study of last days. And I'm fully convinced that we are in the final Jubilee cycle. That means that every 50 years, the timeline has been broken into 50-year increments with Shemitahs. Those are 7-year patterns. So there's 7 times 7, we get 49 years, and there was a year of Jubilee, 1 year of Jubilee in between. So we'd have 50-year increments that break up all of time. And we'd have 120 cycles of 50. And I believe that we are fast approaching the return of Jesus Christ. Therefore, things are ratcheting up to the return of Christ. It is getting intense out there. And Dr. Ford, we were talking about that. Even the role of artificial intelligence and what it's doing to take jobs, to foster a new kind of beast that the world has never seen. It eats, it consumes, it needs immense amount of power to feed it. And if left unchecked, it's to take every job and to create an entire new way of life on the earth. And it is a tool ultimately in the enemy's hands. While we can look at it as a tool to advance our abilities and, our intellect and our ability to do our jobs faster, ultimately it's likened to a beast, right? And so the Bible uses that type of terminology to describe things that are consuming nations, peoples, devices, technology perhaps, that's used to foster and further the devil's agenda. But ultimately all of this is within checks and balances to the restrainer, because the strainer is still at work. And that's why Paul, writing to the church in Thessalonica, tells them that the restrainer is still at work, restraining all of these things until an appointed time when the restrainer is removed, and then judgment begins. The wrath of God will be poured out. So we're seeing building blocks toward that. So that's why we're talking about the last days. We're talking about the book of Daniel, which is the Old Testament piece of what is Revelation to the New Testament. Daniel is to the Old Testament, and its requirement is that we read all 18 prophetic books. So let's get back. Let's read it once again as we examine this. We're going to reread the first part of Daniel chapter 7 and then help set up what we know to be a right study of, I believe what we need to talk about today in just our brief time is really some of the characteristics of this pompous horn that we know him to be the Antichrist, and what are some of the attributes of him. So Dr. Ford, if you could take us back to Daniel chapter 7, verses 7, 8 for a moment. Let's reread that and frame the rest of our discussion here on the program.
It says, "After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes, like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words."
Okay, so what we're talking about here is the end of the kingdoms of men, and it culminates in this fashion. So what we have to examine then is this final kingdom of men under the rule of the Antichrist, and it's in great contrast to the glorious rule of Jesus Christ. So keep in mind in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 4, we read that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts and saying, "Where is the promise of his coming?" They will even go on to say, "It is as it was before." So even as you're listening to this, you're probably in doubt. Maybe a few of you are. But let me assure you that Jesus is coming soon. Therefore, we study eschatology so that we don't lose sight of our mission, because it's too easy to just get entrenched into this world, to be worried about our lawns and our cars and our retirement plans and all the things that are the American dream. And then we forget that we're actually citizens of another kingdom. We're ambassadors of another kingdom. We belong to Jesus. We're supposed to hold loosely to the things of this world. That's why Paul told young Timothy, don't put down deep roots. You're a soldier for Jesus Christ. Don't get entangled into the affairs of this world. Now, that doesn't mean that we just avoid getting involved in topics of politics and public policy and that sort of thing. Don't misuse that text. It means you don't make your identity in the things of this world. So Peter then says, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God? That's 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. So it would be easy to just check out. Go retire on a beach somewhere. But that's not what we're called to do. Like Daniel, he wasn't called to check out. He was called to be a part of this battle, the greatest battle that will ever be. Because once we enter into eternity with Jesus Christ, there will be no more battle. Satan will be bound up forever. He'll be cast into eternal condemnation. We will be with Jesus Christ forever, where there'll be peace forever. So we are but a moment of time dedicating our life and our dedication of allegiance and service to Jesus Christ. Now, obviously, in our 5 minutes that we've got, because time just flies, we're not going to be able to cover everything that I have for you today. So I want to at least just try to get through some of the details about this pompous horn, because even today, you're probably seeing headlines that may cause you confusion. As some will say, okay, as we look to the fact that we are in the time before the end, are we seeing already before us? Are we seeing some kind of indication here that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, that Netanyahu is the false prophet? I saw that headline just the other day and I was like appalled, because it's such biblical ignorance that goes into that. You may not like certain people in politics, but that doesn't mean that that's the person, right? You just say, well, look what they're doing. They must be the Antichrist. Okay, hang on. Let's just go to a biblical worldview. We've got to examine the scripture to understand. Look for a moment here, verse 20, chapter 7. And the 10 horns were on its head, and the other horn which came up before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. We'll come back to that verse. In verses 24 to 25, here's what we read. I'm just skipping ahead a little bit. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. And he shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings, He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half a time. So we'll come back to some of the meaning of all of that. But we read about this last time of Revelation chapter 13 and 17, addressing this beast and his system. And there's so many other supporting texts from Ezekiel 28, Zechariah chapter 1, Matthew 7, Mark 13, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, amongst many others. But I would highly encourage you, go back and read Revelation 13, 1 to 10, and Revelation 17, 8 to 14. Here's some of the bullets. We'll come back to this next week because you're going to need to hear it again. So how do we identify the Antichrist? And that's not our role, by the way. I truly believe we're going to be raptured. I believe in a harpazo. So it's not for us to have to figure out who the lawless one is and try to point people, there he is, there's the lawless one. But what we have to do is have a biblical understanding so that we're not given into deception and temptation to say, oh, there he is, there's the Antichrist, he's already amongst us. Well, he may certainly be alive and well, but I don't want you to take certain political figures and just throw their name into the batch here without a biblical understanding of what the Bible describes him to be. This pompous horn, the Antichrist, he will appear in latter times, according to Daniel chapter 8, verse 23, he will not be fully revealed until the day of the Lord has begun. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. And I believe that's the timing with the rapture. The restrainer is currently hindering him, 2 Thessalonians 2, 6 to 7. This will be preceded by an apostasy, a great rebellion against God and his laws, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and Matthew 24. He arises out of the sea. Now, that's symbolic of the nations of the earth, where the land is often symbolic of Israel, according to Revelation 13. He may be by blood of the tribe of Dan. We'll come back to that. How do we even assess that? Genesis chapter 49, Daniel 11. So when we get Daniel 11, we'll talk more about that. Why he may possibly be of the bloodline of Dan, meaning one of the tribes of Israel, but not necessarily of the nation of Israel. But perhaps. And even Ezekiel 21 gives us a little more on that. He overcomes 3 different rulers in his rise to power, as we just read in Daniel 7, verse 8 and 24. And one of the heads of this beast seems to have a deadly wound, but is healed. Okay, that's from Revelation 13, verses 3 to 14. And that may even correlate with a potential description that we have of the Antichrist in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 17, that he seems to survive a wound of some sort to one of his eyes that heals. It may even be a reference to the kingdom of the beast, where it appears to die and is thus resurrected. And that's why I've even thought about the Ottoman Empire, because if there's a neo-Ottoman Empire, what appeared to die 100 years ago may in fact be being rebirthed even real time right now. He rises through a peace program, Daniel chapter 8, verse 25. He is intelligent and persuasive, Daniel 7, 8 to 11, and chapter 8, verse 23. Subtle and crafty, according to Ezekiel 28, 6. He rules over others by their own consent. In Revelation 17, 13, he rules with absolute authority, and he even tries to change laws and customs. His motivation is power and control, according to Daniel chapter 11, and he has no desire for women. He receives the power that he has from Satan, according to Ezekiel 28, Revelation 13, and Daniel chapter 8. Many believe he will be very influential, even over the Muslim and European nations, able to broker peace for Israel in the Middle East. He makes a 7-year covenant with Israel that he breaks after 3.5 years, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And he introduces idolatrous worship in which he elevates himself as a god on earth, Daniel 9 and 11 and 2 Thessalonians 2. He's a blasphemer toward God. He will gain control over Israel and adjacent territory and even make his headquarters in Jerusalem. We'll be talking about the fact that the Bible even calls him the Assyrian of the North, or the Assyrian. And so we'll come back to this next week. I'm just giving you some clues that help us identify that this is somebody who may be rising to power now, but is not necessarily in power, or may be a player behind the scenes, but he's restrained right now until the Lord determines the time. So if anything, maybe we provoked you to come back next week. Listen again to Engage in Truth, as we'll cover some of this again as we make our way through the vision of these beasts and how we properly interpret it, there's a lot of pieces that we have to give you yet. So come back and listen to Engage in Truth. To listen to this broadcast and others in the series, visit calvaryfountain.com. There you can find this podcast and others. Share them with your friends and family alike. And we'd love to invite you to church. Services are 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Sundays. And again, this is a program of Calvary Fellowship, Fountain Valley Church. We'd love to see you there. God bless you, my friends. Take care.